Recently, it has been argued that certain reproductive genetic manipulation technologies, such as mitochondrial replacement or gene editing through CRISPR, are not really able to say that they're able to save lives, because counterfactually, there isn't anyone's life that's being saved. In the article we looked at for today, Schaefer is going to argue that this is mistaken, that these technologies can be thought about as saving lives when we consider it from a population level analysis. So such reproductive technologies are able to save lives and prevent diseases when we think about it from this perspective. And so such claims that they're not are going to actually be mistaken. Nonetheless, we still need to validate these claims with empirical evidence. So there's been a real lively debate around the moral permissibility of reproductive genetic manipulation technologies, what we're going to call rGMTs, such as mitochondrial replacement techniques, which we'll call MRTs, and gene editing via CRISPR. So the debate has been happening in both the public and academic spheres. The media often portrays rGMTs as a life-saving treatment for lives threatened by heritable diseases. So the common argument is that rGMTs are analogous to other experimental medical treatments that have already been deemed acceptable. So some bioethicists have also framed the argument as using life-saving language or other beneficial language such as therapy, treatment, or preventable diseases. All right, so before we continue on, we need to clearly set aside what we are not talking about. We are not going to be talking about what I'm going to call the non-identity argument. So the idea behind this argument that we're not talking about is that by altering the DNA of the fetus, it affects the identity of the resulting child. And since that therapy is going to affect the identity of the child, it can't be said to be affecting the same person. And so it can't be said to save lives. So for more on this argument, you can check out Zohar 91 and Wrigley et al. 2015. And then you can also check out Elliott 93 and Holtug and Sandhu 96 for arguments against this view. So one of the difficulties with this argument is that it would also seem to apply to other technologies that also seem to affect our identities, such as smartphones or vaccines. Wide adoptions and acceptance of these technologies would also seem to be identity affecting in the same way because their impact on society and people's reproductive actions and choices. So instead, what we are talking about, instead of the non-identity argument, Schaefer is focusing on an argument that was presented by Tina Ruley. So according to her view, the concept of saving a life is going to require counterfactually that someone would die earlier without the intervention. Or in short, her argument is essentially that since it is not inevitable that someone would die if rGMTs were unavailable, then rGMTs do not save lives. So Schaefer argues that Ruley is going to be mistaken about how she understands, the concept of life-saving here, in terms of these counterfactual statement. There is at least one other way of making sense of what it means to save a life, without having to appeal to this counterfactual understanding. So the other alternative is that we could adopt a probabilistic population-level approach to what it means to save a life. So this approach has the benefit of also jibing with claims about major social-altering or society-altering interventions that do seem to save lives. It also retains the central, accurate, and morally relevant implication of saving lives. Since an uptake of rGMTs would lead to a reduction in mortality and a burden of disease. This approach is contingent on there being an actual reduction in mortality and burden of disease, which is something that we're going to have to look for to empirical evidence to further validate. Some women with significantly disordered mitochondria are at a high risk of passing that disorder on to their children. This is because mitochondrial DNA is entirely inherited from the mother. MRT has been designed and used as a way to ensure that affected women can still have healthy babies. So one form of MRT is to transfer nuclear but not mitochondrial DNA from the intended mother's oocyte into a healthy donor's oocyte with the nuclear DNA removed. The oocyte is then fertilized in vitro. Another form is to transfer nuclear DNA from an embryo created by fertilizing the intended mother's oocyte into an embryo created by fertilizing a different mitochondrial-free oocyte. So MRT may be said to save lives of the children that result from the procedure, assuming that it's going to be successful, because they would not inherit the devastating and potentially fatal mitochondrial disease. CRISPR is another way of directly altering the DNA of the embryo. CRISPR can be used to prevent monogenetic disorders. So these are disorders caused by one gene mutation. It might also be able to prevent diseases that are polygenetic in base, meaning multiple genes have to be changed, but this is still very experimental for now. Nonetheless, CRISPR can be said to be life-saving because it can prevent some life-threatening diseases in the resulting children. Tina Ruley offers a two-part definition for what it means for an intervention to save lives. For an intervention X to count as a treatment or cure, in addition to being the case that A, if X is administered, it will help soothe, heal, or remedy someone's illness, it is also the case that B, if X is not administered, a person will suffer more or die earlier than if it had been. So the second part of the definition here is what's known as a counterfactual. This literally means counter to the fact. So in fill 3 terms, this means that the antecedent of the conditional here is not going to be true, but if it was true, then the consequent would follow. In possible worlds terms, there is a closest possible world where the antecedent is true, and in that world, the consequent is also true. All right, so now with this understanding of counterfactuals, let's go back to the second part of the definition here. B, if X is not administered, a person will suffer more or die earlier than if it had been. So to understand this, what it means is in the nearby possible world, if the treatment was not administered, the patients suffer more compared to in similarly relevant worlds where the treatment is administered. So this definition seems to make sense with traditional cures or treatments that have already, have an existing person to benefit. And clearly, when there is someone that is greatly benefiting from an intervention, that's strong reason for us to allow that intervention. The problem is that rGMTs, it's not necessarily clear that there is a person that's going to exist, let alone benefit from these interventions. In this instance, there are 3 possible options for the parents. They could conceive a child using rGMTs, or they could conceive a child without using rGMTs, or they could conceive no children altogether. Since the parents may choose not to conceive any child, there is a possibility where there are worlds in which the potential children do not exist. The third option means that the counterfactual is going to be vacuous, that there are some nearby possible worlds in which these people who would have received the treatment just don't exist. So further, there are other alternatives to rGMT. For example, people can conceive using donor sperm or eggs. They could also adopt a child or forgo having children altogether. Although all these options are going to have some cost, the life of the child is no longer at stake. And given that these stakes are going to be lower, and in light of the considerable objections to rGMTs, such as their safety, efficacy, equity, unnaturalness, the possibility of opening the doors to eugenics, based on those grounds and the lowered stakes, Ruley is going to conclude that allowing or even investing in the development of rGMTs is not going to be justified. The counterfactual that Ruley appeals to seems to be too narrow of a notion of cure or therapy. Normally, the soothing, healing, or remedying someone's illness is going to be sufficient for something to be called a therapy. This is a little more clear in the case of overdetermination of harm. So for instance, suppose that a patient has two illnesses that are causing concurrent symptoms. Well, if one of the illnesses is successfully treated, but the symptoms persist because of the other illness, then the treatment should not be considered, or would not be considered curative under this definition, but that seems to be too strict of a notion. Also, Ruley had considered the counterexample of prenatal consumption of folic acid to prevent neural tube defects. So this also fails to satisfy the antecedent of the counterfactual conditional because it is not inevitable that the prospective parents will have children. Again, there are going to be three options here, and one of them is going to be not having children. Yet, generally, there are no objections to labeling folic acid as therapeutic and claiming that they save lives. Ruley seems to be making an arbitrary distinction here. She, permits the folic acid because it is inexpensive and widely available, so it makes it more permissible for her. But in contrast, the rGMTs are expensive and questionably effective so far. However, the availability and accessibility does not seem to be a morally relevant difference here. Experimental, unproven, prohibitively expensive, or inaccessible remedies would still, under our classification of what a treatment is, they should still qualify. So still, the counterfactual claim can help us understand the value that such treatments have. As Schaefer argues, the counterfactual claim does not serve to undermine rGMTs as a treatment, but rather they can be used to establish how valuable rGMTs are. We cannot establish the value of lives saved from rGMTs based on individual cases, namely because parents might have chosen not to conceive at all, and the supposed beneficiary might not have existed. Instead, we can think about lives saved on the population level. The goal is to reduce the burden of disease in society or to reduce the morbidity and mortality rate of people suffering from the disease. This is a familiar notion of lives saved, especially when we are talking about large population numbers or policy goals. These actions do not need to be justified on the benefits of specific individuals, rather the group level effects are enough to justify them. So thinking about lives saved in this way can help us avoid questions about whether given individuals benefit from the treatment. So Ruley considers this approach but dismisses it because she argues that we should not treat reproductive choices as settled when assessing the moral reasons we have regarding this choice. And she adds that such rates seem to be empirically speculative. So Ruley seems to be answering a different question here, according to Schaefer. Ruley seems to be answering the question, should individuals use rGMT? But rather the central question we've been asking is whether rGMTs actually save lives. To be clear, the population level approach does not take the choice to be fixed, but it should be reasonably integrated with our best evidence about what people actually choose. Since the life-saving potential of any medical intervention depends on a variety of factors, Schaefer does not think that taking these factors into account is going to be empirical speculation. Schaefer still needs to show that rGMTs actually save lives at the population level. Specifically, we need empirical facts to demonstrate the life-saving value of rGMTs. So when we think about the life-saving value at the population level, we need to be considering the following counterfactual. Would mortality rates of a subset of a population be lower if the intervention were available than if it were not? In possible worlds, where rGMT is available, the mortality rate of a subset of a population are lower than the possible worlds where rGMTs are not available. So there seem to be two empirical questions that need to be answered here. First, it would need to be demonstrated that children born using rGMTs have a lower morbidity and mortality rate than children born from the same parents using traditional conception. So essentially, we would need to prove that rGMTs are actually effective, that they're doing what we think they're doing. In 2014, HFEA in the UK gave such an affirmative analysis on the issues in the cases of MRTs. CRISPR could also be considered similarly beneficial, but it's still too early to tell. The first children born using CRISPR so far have, seem to be healthy. However, some have argued that using rGMTs is overly risky and unethical. Specifically, with CRISPR, concerns about mosaicism resulting from a poor understanding of the function of targeted genes has led to the idea that rGMTs exposes children to unnecessary risk. Since the rGMTs and our understanding of genetics is only going to get better, if they're not effective now, they probably will be in the future, and we can only get better at understanding how to target genetic editing to prevent mosaicisms. So it's safe to assume that these technologies, are going to be considered, safe in the near future at the very least. So instead of focusing on this question of effectiveness, Schaefer shifts to the second question, the question about whether these technologies are actually able to save lives at a population level. Specifically, what would parents do if rGMTs are not available? So Schaefer suggests that there are three possible alternatives. First, parents would instead adopt a child or choose to remain childless, and there is no further individuals created. So in these circumstances, we have what's known as a difference numbers case. There's slightly fewer members of the population in these relevant counterfactuals. So comparing different numbers cases are notoriously difficult, but in any case, it's unlikely that fewer individuals would die prematurely in these circumstances. If anything, adoption would somewhat increase the life prospects of children that are being adopted, potentially reducing the mortality rates and leading to more lives saved than if rGMTs were, used. The second option, as Schaefer proposes, is that parents would instead undergo IVF and solicit a donor egg or sperm that is free of heritable disease. So in this instance, we have a simpler case. It's a same numbers case, but there is not likely going to be a difference in the number of lives saved. So a child born of a donor gamete and born via rGMTs are going to have similar likelihoods of health and survival. Indeed, given that rGMTs are still experimental, maybe it's somewhat actually a little bit riskier to use those as opposed to using a donor, which might be considered safer. The third alternative that Schaefer proposes is that parents would instead conceive a child naturally, and that child inherits the mitochondrial disorder. So in this case, it's indeed a strong case we made that rGMTs are actually saving lives. So rGMTs will likely result in a healthier child with typically a higher survival likelihood, while naturally conceiving will likely result in a child with much lower likelihoods of survival, along with other significant morbidity effects. So at the population level, more children would likely die prematurely if this were the case. And making it the case that it's accurate to say that rGMTs could potentially save lives. All right, so now we need to consider the frequency with which each of these instances would happen if rGMTs were not available. If parents predominantly chose to adopt or undergo IVF with a donor egg or sperm, then rGMTs would not have much life-saving value. In contrast, parents, if they predominantly chose to risk it and naturally conceive, then using rGMTs would be justified on life-saving grounds. So to determine whether or how many lives would be saved, we need to answer the question of how many parents would still choose to naturally conceive when rGMTs are available. So this is also how often that it is happening compared to parents adopting or undergoing IVF. So we need to compare it to that as well. So there seem to be two decent sources of information to help us answer this question. There was a Wired article by Art Kaplan in which he claims the need for the procedure is real. Somewhere around 4,000 children per year in the United States are born with a type of mitochondrial disease. Many do not survive more than a few months. Mitochondrial transplants would help prevent these diseases, so why not use them? However, Schaefer is going to push back here a little bit because it's not immediately clear whether any of these 4,000 children or their parents would have really used MRT if it were available. So IVF, so there he gives three reasons. The first one is that IVF is itself expensive, burdensome, and also just many have an objection to MRT. It has a stigma. It's been known as three-parent IVF. So the second reason is notably many of those 4,000 children will have formed mitochondrial diseases that would be preventable by pre-implantation genetic diagnoses. This is a procedure and technique that is widely available now. Since many of them did not undergo PGD, this casts doubt on the idea that many of them would have undertaken MRT. And then finally, it seems that likely the only ones willing to undergo MRT are those who would otherwise opt for adoption or IVF. So all of these reasons, make you think or cast doubt on the idea that actually 4,000 lives might be saved if rGMTs were available, as Art Kaplan claimed. It's probably much less than that. So another data point is that there was a U.S. study that found 90% of carriers of mitochondrial diseases would be interested in using it to have MRT to have a child. But Schaefer also is going to push back here. So the study that they're looking at here had a very small sample size. It only had 21 individuals with that were mitochondrial disease carriers who were actually considered having children. Furthermore, the question was not framed in such a way as to compare rGMTs to other alternatives like adoption or IVF. So further studies of exactly how many lives would naturally Further studies of exactly how many individuals would naturally conceive would need to be done to properly validate and quantify the claims that rGMTs are actually saving lives. In spite of these flaws in the evidence, there is still a non-trivial amount of individuals who would use rGMTs if they were available, and if they were not available. The same parents would conceive naturally and risk the possibility of having a child with a mitochondrial disorder. So the claims that rGMTs prevent disease and save lives are not totally outlandish. They should not be dismissed, but nonetheless, we still need more solid evidence to back them up. It's important that everyone's very careful with how they're using these terms to frame the debate. If we're not careful, we can give inaccurate or misleading impressions about what rGMTs can actually do. When we're using terms like life-saving, we should not be talking about saving individuals who would have otherwise died. It might be that determining whether an individual was saved through a medical intervention is really unknowable. Rather, we can think about rGMTs as potentially saving lives in terms of the probabilistic population level approach. Specifically, rGMTs can be used to reduce the mortality rate of children of a subset of parents who otherwise would naturally conceive a child with a heritable disease. Now, you might be thinking, does really assessing the life-saving potential of rGMTs really important? Well, here's three relevant instances where it would matter. One, whether these treatment options should be permitted in the first place. Two, whether resources should be invested into the research and development. And three, under what conditions, if any, should we actually use them? So everyone should be careful with how we think and talk about the life-saving impact of these technologies. But but that should be weighed against the odds of a child with the disease being conceived without these genetic interventions. It would probably be worthwhile, at least from a policy and resource allocation perspective, to look into the odds of varying diseases within certain populations. But since it could be the case that the risks or the negative social impacts or the opportunity costs outweigh the lives saved and the benefits that they provide, that Schaefer is not actually advocating that rGMTs should be promoted or provided. Rather, Schaefer is making the more modest claim that the life-saving effects of rGMTs should be considered as a legitimate factor in the public debates.